Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. Bob, good to be back with you again. And today we're continuing on with our series on the theology of the body and healing. Last episode, we talked about male, and today we're talking about female. I'm excited about this episode, and obviously Bob and I aren't women. And so what we're going to be offering is what we've learned in our practices, in our time as therapists, and as well as what we've learned in study and what we've learned in just the healing ministries, et cetera. And so we just want to tread with the utmost respect that what we're saying is things we hope that will bless you and that will resonate with you. We're pretty confident that they will, but we feel like the utmost respect is needed there. Bob, anything you want to add with that?
Yeah, and we both have lived with women for most of our life. Not that we've always addressed it well in
Yes.
all of our interactions, but I think for both of us, we've learned quite a bit about the heart of a woman from our personal experience too.
That's very true. Yeah. I would say a lot of what I'm going to share today has been my learning and sitting at the feet of Heather and what she's taught me about the heart of a woman. And so hopefully that will come out and will bless people. So our quote for today is the same as last episode because, we're spending right here this specific time talking about male and female. So here it is again from Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So that's our quote again and again. This is where John Paul II spends ample time in the Theology of the Body catechesis, breaking open the depth and the meaning of masculinity and femininity and their call to union, which fully images God. So, Bob, anything nuancing here in particular for woman?
Yes. What does it mean to be female in the image of God and different than male? A different aspect, even though they're integrated, a different aspect of God's heart. So we talk about, in the scripture, we talk about God saying, even if your mother and father forsake you, I will never forsake you. The tenderness of God, the nurturance of God, the receptivity of God. Seems strange, but, all of those aspects. And it's tied into the name for woman or for female in that scripture, which is Negaba, N apostrophe Qebah. Yeah, it's hard
Hebrew.
to spell, and it's spelled in different ways. So yeah, I'm not saying that's the official way, but that's the way that John Paul II's
And
theology of
so
the body spells it.
that's the word that's used in the original Hebrew for that particular word. Woman is negaba.
For female.
For female. Negaba.
Yeah.
Okay.
Negaba.
Yeah.
And it literally means open. So woman or female is one who is open to receive. Again, I don't think we've seen a model of complete freedom in any of the women around us, just like we've not seen a perfect picture of male around us. But in Mary, we have what God intended from the beginning of creation in woman. And her, may it be done according to your word, her fiat wasn't just a momentary fiat, it was a lifelong fiat. It's what it
Right.
means to be full of grace. And,
Yeah.
and a woman who's living in her femininity is full of grace and beauty and tenderness and openness and receptivity. And in that, she invites us into communion. A redeemed, healed heart of a woman invites us into communion.
Yes.
And so every morning, as part of my prayer time, I just rest as a little one on the heart of Mary and just receive the nurture for the places where my heart's not yet open, not yet free, not yet safe. How about for you? What speaks to you there?
As I was studying this, and I've known this, just the nuance itself is really beautiful about what John Paul II is doing and then how this connects to healing, because we often can make man and woman in our image instead of God's image. And so studying male and female and letting it teach us about God is really beautiful because woman is open and vulnerable. And so to have a God who is open and vulnerable sure strikes against the typical image that he's a mean tyrant, right? God is open to the sinner. God receives the sinner into him and heals, right? So this openness and vulnerability, God makes himself vulnerable to our rejection of him, especially in the person of Christ. The vulnerability of God becoming man made him subject to death.
Mm.
It's so beautiful when we allow woman to be an icon through which we can look back at God. And so many of the tyrannical images that we have of God get corrected because he's vulnerable. He receives the sinner. He's open to those of us who want to come and rest in him and with him.
He is beauty in essence. He is mystery, all the things we use to describe the woman's identity.
Two things come to mind with that. One is, in my own struggles and journeying through of distorted views of sexuality, et cetera, one thing that was always said to me is that woman is not God. And the reason that had to be clarified for me is because woman is so beautiful, she can be mistaken sometimes.
Mm.
She's the crown of creation. And anybody who's willing to be honest will look at woman across the board. I don't mean like cover models on the magazines. It's not what I'm talking about. Like that's a cultural definition. I'm talking about woman. Like wars fought over them and like just absolute chaos and craziness over the beauty of one woman. Right? I mean, nobody fights a war over some dude being so handsome. It just doesn't happen. Right? It's not there. And the reminder is like she's not God, because I think there's this temptation in culture to be so enamored with woman that we forget that she's still an image bearer. And I say that in honor of women. I think there's really something beautiful about the experience of Adam when he sees woman for the first time. And he says, at last, and it's as he saw her, at last, this one's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It's like his breath is taken away. That is when we see God. It's like, at last, this is the satisfaction I've been looking for, right? There again, woman's just an icon. So I'll stop there. Just like last episode, we're going into how does a woman reveal God's glory? How is woman wounded in particular? How do women wear fig leaves? And then how is woman healed? So those kind of where we're headed. And anything else you want to add to how women reveal God's glory before we go into women being wounded?
I'm thinking about your wife's podcast with Sister Miriam and Michelle and how attractive the three of them are as they just share their life and share their vulnerability and just invite people in. I mean, that's what I experience, when they start with their cup of coffee and they just invite women into their
Welcome
hearts.
home is
Yeah.
They're what our tagline. Yeah.
Yeah. And then my daughter Carrie and the women in our ministry who do the women's conference, and I was thinking about how that's really the format that we're talking about today is the format that they use in laying out the conference and looking at who woman is and Mary being the model of it. So I was thinking of both those things as you were speaking.
Yeah. I actually recommend that podcast to seminarians that I work with.
Yes.
If you're trying to understand and learn the heart of a woman, this is a great way to get a pulse on various women and how they interact and the heart of women. I think it's fantastic. But
one more word on that. I just loved their podcast on Mother's Day, and they each described what the gifts that they received from their mother.
Yes.
And you could just see it in each of them. I know all three of them fairly well, and you certainly do. But just to see as they were describing their mothers, the reflection of them in that. And one of the things that you were talking about before about vulnerability, in our culture, that's become a bad word. And yet vulnerability and receptivity are synonymous. To be receptive is to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable is to be receptive.
Yes.
And it's beauty. This experience is when you see a woman who's open and receptive and vulnerable, you're just immediately drawn to that receptivity and that vulnerability.
Yes. I think I want to nuance something that maybe women have maybe wondering about, well, can a woman be strong? And, I had a friend of mine who spent a good deal of time praying about Our Lady. And one of the nuances that she made is she said, I've never seen Our Lady with a sword, and yet she's always destroying a serpent.
Mm.
And it was interesting. And she said, as she sat with, why is that? And she said, her greatest power is her vulnerability and her beauty. A sword's not necessary. It was her wisdom, and I went, whoa, is that ever deeply insightful, where her strength, her power is in her identity. Like, it's not something else that has to be added on. And that was a woman that I trust praying into, why don't you see women with swords? Why don't you see Our Lady and all of Christian art with a sword? Now, maybe there's one out there, but from
Yeah.
her point of view. And
Wonder
she
Woman.
said, oh, that's a little bit different. Yeah, right. But yeah, she said,
Yeah.
our Lady's beauty and vulnerability is where the power, her yes to the Lord is why the enemy's defeated.
Yes.
She
Yes.
doesn't need a sword. And yet, when we get into how women are wounded, it's right in their vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
where they're most assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how many hours I've spent with women in a clinical setting and witnessed and heard about the ways that their vulnerability was taken advantage of.
Oh, yeah.
It's unbelievable. And a lot of, the modern feminist movement, in some ways, there's a lot of that's not good about it, but in some ways, it's this, would you stop abusing my vulnerability? I don't want to be vulnerable anymore.
Yeah.
It's a rejection of vulnerability because of how often it gets abused. And, rejecting your identity is never the solution to something. But I can see the fear, It really is sad for me how women can so often feel so unsafe.
Mm.
Because they feel so vulnerable and exposed. And when I connect to that, my masculinity wants to do something about that. And then I think things start to getting back in a little bit more order. But I know your experience is the same,
Oh,
Bob.
so much. Yeah. It's the suffering of a woman's heart because she loves so deeply. In fact, that goes back right to the initial curses, right? It's your desire is going to be for your husband, and he will dominate you, and your suffering is going to be with your children. It talks about childbirth there, but it's
Yes.
a woman's heart is so intimate with their child,
Yes.
starting in the womb, that a woman suffers with children long after they're out of her womb and into life and out on their own, more than
Right.
a man can comprehend. We suffer with our children, but it's like a woman suffering with her children is in union in the way that God suffers with us.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like from a heart place. In fact, that word compassion is connected to the word womb,
Mm-hmm.
right? In Hebrew, the compassion of God is a word like rahamin or something like that, and it means the womb. And so when Jesus is filled with compassion, it's almost like the Father's womb wanting to draw the children in to protect them and nurture them, and that capacity of a woman for communion and intimacy in that way creates a lot more suffering,
Oh,
or at
so
least
true.
more capacity for suffering.
Yeah, we've seen it. And Christopher West has this phrase. I don't know where he got it from, but I just remember him saying it. If you ever want to see what's most holy, look at that which is most violently profaned.
Mhm.
There is no denying that throughout history, woman has been the target of so much profanity, which speaks to, as he's trying to redeem that, speaks to her greatness, the feminine genius, as John Paul II calls it. And I think, we can hear the word genius and go, oh, like smart. And no, as in the brilliance of
Brilliance.
God's creation manifest,
Yeah.
like she was the crescendo of the symphony. If you're following along in creation, like that's the boom and all the
Yeah.
trumpets blare and everything. Like, you know what it is? When something incredibly beautiful gets damaged, it hurts more,
Yeah.
right? When something delicate and beautiful is wounded, it's like it's worse. I don't know, it has a deeper pain to it when a flower's just snapped and broken, right? It's like a worse tragedy in a way. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, my grandson, my youngest grandson, was hitting his sister the other day, and I said, "You don't hit girls. You don't hit your sister."
Mhm.
And his sister says, "Why not?" It's
Mm.
just how differently the culture has changed from when we were younger,
You're
where it
right.
was just such a clear parameter as,
Yeah,
a woman is to be treasured and not violated, not hit, not hurt.
right.
Uh, Whereas now, we've kind of lost some of that,
Mhm.
and even with the modern feminist movement, it's a kind of misogyny. Misogyny,
Mm.
the word means a hatred of the feminine, and male domination is a misogyny, clearly. And
Yes.
the women's movement has come in response to that, but it's done the same misogyny in the sense of we need to hate femininity and become more like men so
Mm,
that we're protected and safe, as you were talking about before. But in that, woman closes. When
mm,
woman loses her vulnerability and she's not safe and she closes, then the
mm,
beauty begins to fade. And that's where some of the fig leaves come because now the beauty becomes an external, like
mhm,
how beautiful my house looks or how beautiful my clothes or the makeup that I wear, middle school
mhm.
girls and the makeup
Yeah.
and how beautiful my body is. And, certainly men contribute a lot to that whole thing.
Yeah,
But
they do. Yeah.
uh but that outward beauty that isn't reflected in an inward beauty becomes a fig leaf. And, St. Peter says, "Women, be like the women of old in their humble submission to God,
Mm,
and let your beauty be the inward spirit,
mm,
not the outward adorning." And it's nothing, I mean, we both love to see beautiful women and beautiful clothes and beautiful hair and beautiful houses, and, it's not a matter of disdaining that, it's a matter of it becomes a fig leaf if it's covering the
mm,
internal heart, the internal
mm,
vulnerability.
mm,
And I don't know about you, but I experience a woman who's hardened, no
mm,
matter how physically beautiful she is she doesn't draw me.
mhm.
But a
It's
woman
true.
whose heart's open is just such a draw. Whether she's physically stunning or not, she's just such a draw
Oh,
because
that's
of
true.
the depth of her heart.
That's so true. One of the things that I wrote down here about how woman is wounded, and this is one of the ones I've learned just from reading, and Heather kind of helped echo this, is women are wounded when they're told or treated with this kind of double bind. And here's the double bind. On one hand, you're too much, and on the other hand, you're not enough. And so a real assault on the heart of a woman comes in where you're too emotional, you're too needy, you need too much attention, you're too much. And then at the exact same time, you're not pretty enough, you don't do enough, you don't whatever. And it seems like there's this really particular way in which women's hearts get assaulted by having that double bind of a lie. It seems like that's maybe universal to the heart of a woman. It's just, how does that come out for you? And so I've learned that women really can be assaulted in that particular way with regard to being too much and not enough at the same time, and then they feel stuck and like they can't open because then people will be overwhelmed by them, or they'll open and be found inadequate. And
Yeah.
it's just this terrifying kind of double binding, imprisoning experience.
I think of my daughters when they were going through middle school and, the middle
Mm.
school ought to be outlawed. But,
It's so true. Let's
uh,
throw in high school while
just
we're at
just
it.
how deeply wounded they were by the cruelty of not only the boys, but the girls, and the envy and
Yes.
your hair is this or you're not
Yes.
this or you're this and, you know, you're too much, you're not enough.
Yeah, all at the same time. Yeah, and I would echo the same. My kids have had, on and off struggles in that time where, it was something I've learned as a father just watching, and Heather really helped me see this too, as she said, the fighting of boys is very different, right? We chuckle about it, but there's something interesting there where two boys can get in an argument and sometimes it'll go to blows. But you can literally come back to school the next day and they're like, "Hey, what's up, man?" Not much, right? But that just doesn't happen with women. I think, the word vicious at
Yeah.
times,
Uh,
and I just go, wow, like you said, the cruelty and the viciousness. And often what I've observed is that it's relational.
yes.
The wounds often come in the relationship, right? The person who should have loved me took advantage of me.
Mhm.
The one who I thought I could trust betrayed me.
Yeah.
I think
And
there's something unique about that.
it's
Yeah.
because the gift and the calling is relational. I mean, what does openness mean but receptivity to relationship? Woman at the very beginning is relational in God's
Yes.
creation and not secondary as a helpmate, but as a equal
Mhm.
of a union, a communion with the man, and she brings communion everywhere she goes. Woman, by the nature of her heart, brings communion wherever she goes, and so that's the place where she's gonna get wounded. Just like
Mm.
for us, it's gonna be in our adequacy,
Mhm.
as men. For a woman, it's in her relational capacities, and so a woman becomes cruel when she's been hurt so much in her relationship and closes and then either controls, like we talked about last time, there's the two sides.
Yeah, overcompensate, undercompensate.
So what would that look like for a woman, that overcompensation and undercompensation?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I've noticed it has been just like you're saying, when their vulnerability is when they close because of some kind of wound, there's a hardness to them, and so there's a domination that occurs and a control that occurs, and I'll find it like an example would be bitterness.
Mhm.
A woman who's always finding the wrong and who has a harshness to her. She's always criticizing. She's always harsh. Like there's a cut to her tone or how she treats someone or whatever. And that's where I think it becomes that's the vicious. That would be an extreme example, but I think bitterness, control, and domination. I'm going to have to be the one who takes care of this, and I'm not going to create room for other people to flourish. I'm going to dominate and criticize and overwhelm. You have a really cool story about how some of the original meetings of the modern feminist movement. Why don't you share that story?
Yeah, this is from Carrie Gress's book, The Anti-Mary Exposed, and in her introduction, just really eye-opening because it's what you feel as the spirit behind the movement sometimes. She said there were 12 women that gathered in this New York City boardroom, and the leader says, "Why are we here?" And they chant back, "Revolution." What kind of revolution? To destroy patriarchy. How do we destroy patriarchy? By destroying the family, by destroying the patriarch, by abortion, by lesbianism,
Promiscuity. Yeah.
promiscuity, just
Yeah.
everything we're seeing in our culture. And again, it's not these women. I mean, they're there participating. It's the evil one working through their woundedness. As Carrie goes into the story, Carrie Gress goes into the story, she talks about how so many of their mothers were either mentally or emotionally ill or badly dominated by their husbands or weak, passive women that they couldn't look up to. And
Mm.
so many of these women that were in that boardroom had become lesbians, looking for both love from a woman and power over a woman, which is what's tied into that lesbianism, both of those. And so in that, the women's movement has its spirit. And again, it's beyond the women. I mean, I just have
Yeah.
compassion for the women
Yes.
and their growing up and their childhood, but it's that spirit and then the culture supporting that spirit, which creates such distortion. And again, I think of Jezebel in the Old Testament. Jezebel, this hardened woman who was ruthless.
Mhm.
To me, that's like the extreme misogyny, the extreme hatred for the feminine nature.
Mm. Yeah, it's a rejection of their identity. I think one of the things that's coming up when I think again about, how the wound of woman and how woman compensates is, again, Genesis gives us a nice kind of lens to look through. And so we take the experience of Genesis and it applies in lots of areas of life. And so the one that jumps out at me is a particular wound that comes for a woman is when she's abandoned.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is in the garden, it was Adam's job to guard the garden, and Adam's nowhere to be found. He's watching Monday Night Football or he's out at the bar with his buddies, right? Whatever. So he's not there. And the serpent comes in. So, number one, that should have never happened. She's caught vulnerable in what's supposed to be safe, and she's abandoned, and there's no one there for her. And then how the enemy assaults her is through doubt of what she knows to be true. She heard the command of the Lord, and the enemy starts to plant seeds of doubt about what the truth is, where life's going to come from, etc. And I think that is a deep wound for women when they're abandoned and the enemy assaults them with doubt, especially in the areas of life and relationship. And so, what I find that you can have with a woman is that because of that doubt, they will dominate. To remove all doubt, they'll take utter control. Or on the flip side of that, they'll just give up. They'll just have almost a carelessness about their own dignity because they doubt whether or not they matter.
Mm.
I imagine Eve's experience after the fact was Adam is probably stunned and he's looking around and he's like, what the hell are we going to do? And I imagine Eve is heartbroken
Yeah.
because she felt the relational loss there. And now she's worried about this man who is supposed to protect her. Now she has to protect herself from him.
Yeah.
And that abandonment and isolation leaves her empty. right? And so what I find on the flip side is that because she's empty, that ache for relationship sometimes goes to the point where she disregards her own dignity simply to have the satisfaction of relationship. And that can manifest itself in promiscuity. That can even manifest itself in having an unhealthy relationship with your child because you're a single parent and now your oldest son is now your husband in a way, right? That parentification that we see, and that's a clinical word for it, but
Yeah.
even sometimes in food,
Yeah.
right? Just the ache to not be abandoned and to not be alone, I think can sometimes result in carelessness or impurity. I think it's in the heart of a woman to care,
Yeah.
to be full of care. And when women become careless, they just give up.
Mhm.
They abandon their little ones, right? And they just go, I'm done. I
Yeah.
can't do this.
And even abandon themselves. It's like,
Yes.
I don't care about me anymore. Uh,
Right.
you see the series, The Chosen, have you watched that?
Yeah. Some of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the first one, beautiful interaction between Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Hmm.
And, as they tell the backstory, I mean, this is just a beautiful picture of both the brokenness and the healing. So, the backstory is that her father dies, who she's very close to, and she goes then searching for love and getting in and inviting all kind of demonic stuff into her heart. But the scene that they show with her and Jesus on that first episode is just so beautiful.
Hmm.
And she's still hardened, but
Hmm.
he just comes in tenderness and protection and tells her who she is.
Hmm.
And then when he speaks something to her heart that her father said, you just see this release of the
Hmm.
hardness, and it's like she comes into his heart, and he wraps his arm around her. It's just a beautiful picture of the redemption of a woman, and then we see in history, she's the one who ends up at the cross,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
She's the one who ends up at the tomb the first day. I mean,
Yes.
the loyalty and the love and the
Mm.
devotion of Mary Magdala, because she experienced a man who remembered
Yes.
and moved into her and didn't run
Amen.
away from her and didn't use her. Before that, whether she was prostitute or not, I mean, that's
Mhm. Yeah.
speculation, but, a woman who gets to that place of not caring so much that she's willing to be used is a way that openness gets so violated, and it's another way of closing because it's
Yes.
like, I don't care anymore. I'm just so abandoned, so desolate. My life
Yes.
doesn't matter.
When I've worked with some women who were very promiscuous, and as we tried to process some of that intensity, what they began to tell me is it started in a place of careless where they didn't care, but then they realized that in that space they had power.
Mhm.
So they allowed themselves to be violated only to lord it over the man. They realized this is how I can get back at you. They segregated their body from themselves to have an authority back over the man again. And so it turned back into domination or control for her. This was how this client described it as I allowed myself to be promiscuous because that's how I could get back at them. I
Mhm.
could tell them what to do. I could control them. And I thought, wow, it went almost a full circle in a way, from one side of the spectrum to the whole other side, all in an attempt to be safe
Yeah.
again. You know,
Yep.
when you talk about, the chosen, we start to get into healing now. So how about
Yep.
let's
Yeah, I was
let's
thinking of that too.
and you said something, Bob, that I find really beautiful. As you said, Jesus received Mary,
Yeah.
and right there, you're nuancing the exact image of woman that's in God, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The female's made to receive, and Jesus receives her,
Yeah.
and that's how she is comforted, right?
Yeah.
There's a quote unquote femininity to
Yeah.
that,
He both blesses and protects and receives.
right?
And so she's now safe enough to open and to mirror back the receptivity.
I think that's one of the cool ways that the church is referred to as a female.
Yeah.
Mother Church is the way that we reference that because she receives Mother Church sinners into her womb, which is, often the baptismal area is often considered the place where the children are born.
Mm,
And that's where baptisms occur, right? Right at the baptismal fonts.
mm.
And the places where, the church receives Christ into her and then gives Christ back to the faithful and the Eucharist. And so Mother Church has such a beautiful imagery. And I mean, so often we've found, whether it be in the spiritual realm or just in people, for some reason they find deep comfort in entering into a church like a womb. Churches are places where people go back to be formed and to receive the nourishment that they need.
Yeah.
Even the doors have a place where you dip your fingers because it's a place where you re-enter in and you're reminded of who you are as you go and sit in the womb and are nourished again by Christ. So again, it's not coincidence that we call her Mother Church.
Yeah, and what a false witness it becomes when that community doesn't have communion and is not welcoming.
Yes.
And so we're going looking for a place where we can belong, have relationship, receive nurture, receive love, be fed. And when that's missing, then there's something inherently lacking in that experience of connection.
Yeah, exactly. What, domination from a church or carelessness from a church?
Yeah.
Those are just like with woman. I think one of the other ways that two other things that come to mind for me when with woman is healed, for a woman to be seen, understood, and honored. And I think it's a restoration of the original experience of Adam looking upon woman and saying, "At last, you are bone of my bone." It seems that healing occurs when they're seen, even if it's their sin or their wounds if they're seen and understood. Boy, is that one a real important one I've learned. Being understood and then being honored. I love you. You matter. I see you, I understand you, and I honor you. I found that to be a critical thing for the healing of a woman that either men or other women can do.
Yeah, I agree. And, both men and women need that, but there's a particular way in which a woman receiving that, she then becomes the agent of that for everybody. She becomes the one who sees and knows and receives into her.
How about for you?
Another thing that I hear a lot is the need for a woman to be protected so that she can be vulnerable. So on places, again, some of the areas I'm dealing with in my own life where I've kind of backed away from confrontation, it has left the women in my life feeling unprotected, and therefore not safe. And I realized that for them to feel safe, I need to step in and protect. And it's not that they can't protect. That's not the message. We have an image on the front cover of our Restoring the Glory, which is Mary holding Jesus and Joseph behind Mary and being the covering over them, not in a dominating way, but in a protective way. And it's in that Mary can then be fully present in her communion because she's safe and protected. We've done this in demonstrations. You take Joseph out of there, and what happens to Mary and Jesus? When my dad left and my mom was left with us kids, she was left unprotected, and we were all left unprotected. But she was left to have to fend for and to do all those things that she shouldn't have had to do on her own.
What you're talking about is directly seen in the early months of Jesus's life.
Yeah.
Where it's Joseph who receives the message to protect from the assault of Herod. The message was given to Joseph to provide environment for them to be safe.
Yeah. And then we're probably starting to move over into the next podcast, which is talking about the dynamic between men and women. How about practical? Do you have a practical?
Yeah, I think one of the practicals that comes to mind, a woman needs an environment. And I don't mean that so specifically as like a literal room, but I do mean it there too. But women are healed when they have an environment to bring life and beauty. And part of the practical there is open the doors for women to bring what they can bring, and they will experience healing because there's an honoring of who they are. So here's an example. Heather essentially designed our new house that we're in. My job was to give her the environment to bring her life and beauty. Here's another one. In seminarian formation, Pope Francis just actually talked about this just recently. Heather was showing me an article about it where how important it is for women to be involved in seminarian formation. It's not about women should be priests. It's that we need to open the door for women to bring who they are into these critical areas and places. I would say for me, where I've seen that most tangibly has been in the men's retreat. So I'm running an all men's retreat, and the essential people for it are the women who I open the door for, and they make it stunning.
Yes.
And it's not feminine. Like the guys walk in and go, wow. And I'm looking at it going, I could have not done a darn thing to accomplish this environment that ushers in intimacy with God.
Mm.
So I call it opening the door. So the question becomes, where can I open the door for a woman to experience healing? It's kind of this gentlemanly thing, but it doesn't mean women can't open doors for other women.
Yeah.
Opening a door for them to be able to be who they were designed to be.
I have a practical for both men and women. Go the next 24 hours and pay attention to the women that you're around who are open and vulnerable in what you experience, and the women that you're around who have closed off for whatever reason in what you experience. And just make a study of it. Just make a study of your own heart.
I think that's really good. And again, it echoes what we said last time. Bring Jesus in.
Yes.
Bring Jesus in and expect healing in words and deeds, signs and wonders in the sacraments. Women, if you've got really deep places of vulnerability, like bring it to the sacraments, bring it to confession, bring it to the Eucharist. And you might need to find a therapist or somebody who works through and works on those dynamics with you. And it's been a pleasure, I have to say, Bob. I know you and I, with all of the women that we've had the privilege of being able to work with, it's been an incredible pleasure to be able to witness and facilitate healing in their lives as a man. It's one of my greatest treasures in my professional life, is being able to be a part of so many women's restoration. So I'm very, very grateful for that. We're grateful for you. We're grateful that you're on the journey here with us. And if you like this episode, we encourage you to share it with a friend. You can find our podcast there on iTunes, or you can find it anywhere else that you find podcasts, or you can send them to our website, which is restoretheglorypodcast.com. God bless you. And we pray that you would experience the abundance of God's love, mercy, and healing.